Hey guys, it's Katie and welcome back to my YouTube channel today. Today's video is the first in a three-part series that I'm sharing this week here on my channel. I am going to be showing you guys today the steps that I take to create the fun wood signs that I sell in my store and in my online Etsy shop. In the different Facebook groups that I'm in, one of the questions I see asked the most is, how do you create these signs? How do you get perfect signs? What are some tips and tricks to creating fun and cute wood signs like I have here? So today's video is going to be a very in-depth, step-by-step. I'm going to talk about the type of wood that I use, how I frame, how I stencil, how I paint, everything, how I do it. Now, I decided to just show you guys what I do versus showing you all of the different things that can be done. So today is going to be video 1 in this series, and as soon as they are all posted, I'll make sure that I link them all together in the 3 videos. The next 2 videos are just going to give you some other ideas for sign making, but today's video is very in-depth, showing you guys the tools that I use and the paint that I use and the stencil technique that I use, and I hope that you guys can learn something from it, and I hope that it inspires you to get crafty while you're stuck at home. First things first, guys, is going to be the wood that we're going to use for our signs. Obviously, you want to get some good quality wood. I always get mine from the local lumber yard. I don't usually go to the big box stores because we are too far away from them. So I get all my wood from the local lumber yard, and I usually go and get large quantities at once, and then I use it until it's gone, and then I get more. So usually I start with the 1x12s and the 1x6s. Those are the 2 basic sign sizes that I create. And to square them up, you need to remember that they're not actually 12 inches wide. So they're 11¼ and 5½ inches wide. And if you want them to be actually square, you need to measure that length to cut it down. So I usually do like a 12x12 and sometimes a 12x18. And then these ones I usually do longer signs, or sometimes even just smaller signs work perfectly for that. And then for my frames, I get a 1x4 and have them rip it in half. So it ends up being 1 by 1 3/4. And these are what I happen to like the best for my frames. So that's something you need to remember. I always have them rip it down before I bring it home, but we do have a table saw if I ever had to rip it down myself. So something you need to remember, that you're going to need some sort of saw to cut these, and I like to use my miter saw, and then I can just measure it and cut it down. Before I get going, I want to share with you guys the tools and products that I use, and make sure that you know everything will be linked in the description box down below. So first of all, when you are weeding your stencils, you're going to need some sort of weeding tool. This one is from Cricut, as well as some tweezers. You're going to need a burnishing tool. An old credit card or old debit card would work. You'll also need some fine tip paint brushes, and I will talk to you later about the paint marker. You may also want to have a sanding block or sandpaper handy. This is the Oramask stencil vinyl that I use, and the paper transfer tape that I prefer to use as well. And all of these things, like I said, will be linked down below where you can find them. Next up is paints and stains. I prefer the Folk Art brand of chalk paint. I do use the Waverly, and I have used acrylic paints as well. I apply them with a foam brush and then the makeup sponges when I am adding in the stencil color.
You'll also maybe want some Mod Podge. I do have some Rust-Oleum spray to seal things, but I hardly ever seal my signs. And then the stains that I prefer are both the Cabot and Minwax stains, but I really love the Minwax gel stains because they don't have as much odor and they dry a lot quicker. And then finally, my favorite tool is my Ryobi Airstrike brad nailer. So let's head back out to the garage and I'll show you guys how I make my signs.
So when I'm framing my boards, the first thing I like to do is measure the sides. Whatever you determine to be the sides of your boards, measure those and then cut down your frame pieces. And then when you measure from here, you're going to want to measure the whole width and have that be your bottom frame. Now, one thing I want to mention as to why I put the longer pieces on the top and the bottom. If you're making a sign that is going to just sit on a shelf, I have this one here to show you guys. If I want it to sit nicely, I want to make sure that this is all flush and level. Whereas if you were to turn it over and maybe one of these boards you measured a little bit wrong and it was a little bit longer, sometimes I do that and I leave it because I like that rustic look, but it may not sit level on your surface. So this is one tip that I like to always make sure that the longer board is going to be on the bottom. The same goes for these longer boards. If I'm gonna frame this, I would still put the longer board along the bottom. It will help it to sit much nicer. We are ready to paint, and I prefer to use Waverly chalk paint. This is from Walmart. I also like the folk art chalk paint that you can order on Amazon. Acrylic white paint works just as well, and you'll want to put 2 coats on, especially when you're using white. You want to make sure that you cover it and give it a nice solid surface. So make sure you've got your 2 coats of white paint on. Once you've got your paint on here and you've let it dry, then it's time to put your stencil on. I use the Oramask blue stencil vinyl, and I just use my Cricut machine. Any kind of vinyl cutter would work perfectly. And then I prefer to use paper tape paper transfer tape when you are transferring it over to this. And I'm gonna link both of those up. There's a couple of places where I've gotten them before and a couple of places that offer them as a bundle. So if you're wanting to get into sign making and learn how to do it, but this blue stencil vinyl works really well. I will tell you that in the past I have used contact paper, really cheap contact paper that you can get from the dollar store. The only thing I want to tell you guys is do not get clear contact paper, because you will have a heck of a time trying to see your project and see what you're weeding out. So if you can get really cheap contact paper at the dollar store or wherever, the hardware store, make sure that it's dark or patterned in some way that you're going to be able to see to weed it. So I've weeded out everything that I am going to want to paint on here, and I've applied my transfer tape, and I'm ready to adhere it to my sign. I want to tell you guys something that I have said multiple times in my videos. I do not measure. I really just wing it. And I know that that might drive some people crazy, and I apologize. Okay, so I'm just going to hope for the best. And normally I've got a pretty good eye about this. And then you'll just want to burnish this on really good. And then slowly remove your transfer tape. And another tip for you guys, if you remove it at an angle like so, it will come off a lot easier versus going straight across. And as you're going along, you may have some pieces, like that little dandy piece of the A. I think it's because it's upside down. Nope. You may also need to just kind of go over this with your finger really carefully so that you don't nab anything. But just to make sure it's good and pressed down around the edges. Fix any little pieces that may need to be fixed. And then depending on how much room you gave yourself and how messy you are, you may want to put down some blue painter's tape. It just depends on your preference and how messy you're gonna be. Now, this is the trick that I really wanted to make sure you guys knew. It doesn't usually matter. I mean, I have not had any problem with my Waverly chalk paint, with the folk art chalk paint, and even with acrylic paints. I've not had any problems, but what I want to do to make sure that there is no bleeding underneath here is just go over all of this with the same base color. That will provide a nice little seal around here. So I'm just gonna go over this with my chalk paint. You don't have to do a lot, but you do want to make sure that you've gotten a nice seal on there. And then I always let this dry. Usually what I'll do is do a bunch of these all at once and then just kind of assembly line them. Those little pieces don't want to stick. And let these dry overnight. Chalk paint dries pretty fast, so you don't really need to let it go overnight, but you do want to make sure that this layer is nice and dry. So it usually is just an overnight thing for me because that's what I'm doing. So I'm going to let this dry, and then I'm going to come back in with my opposite colors and paint the rest of it. And this will provide a nice little barrier so that if you get crazy with your top coat, it won't bleed underneath. One other trip. Now, maybe you decided to stain your board and you don't have a base coat. You can also use Mod Podge. So when you put your stencil on there, then just use a layer of Mod Podge and let that dry, and then go back over it with your color, and it will create a nice little barrier, and hopefully you won't have as much bleed underneath there. When we get to painting the top coat, I'll also give you some more tips on making sure that you won't get any bleed. So even though I have still got my barrier around there, I'm still going to be very careful when I'm applying my black paint. And I'm just using a makeup sponge. And I'm just going to kind of dab it off and then go over and lightly bounce my paint on. And you want to make sure that you go over this really, really well and get all of the pieces, because if you miss anything, it's kind of a pain to go back after you take your stencil off. you will be able to see just a little bit. And like I noticed that I'm missing some right there, and I think even right there. So just make sure you've got all of it covered up really well, but don't press too hard because that is what causes the bleed, and you really shouldn't once you have it sealed with your white, but just in case. Then while that black paint is drying, you can go ahead and stain or paint your frames. When it comes to stain, I tend to go with a nice water-based poly stain most of the time. I did use this Cabot, and this is the dark oak. Sometimes I like them a little bit darker. I don't have any of my other stains out here right now, but I do also like this Minwax gel stain, and I'll link both of these. Both of these brands are good. The gel stain will dry a lot faster and has a lot less fumes than regular stain does. So if that's something that bothers you, that's something you can think about. And I'm gonna pull this back over here, and I am ready to peel off my stencil. You will probably want a pair of tweezers handy to help you with this step. And it is still a little bit wet, but it is mostly dry. And you'll just want to be careful when you're using your tweezers that you don't gouge the wood. And I like to keep a paper towel or something handy if my tweezers get paint on them, because I don't want to transfer the paint anywhere else. So now I'm just gonna go through and weed out the rest of the stencil, and this is probably the most satisfying part of the whole project. If you have any places where you feel like you need to do any touch-ups, like I knew that little 3 right there didn't weed very well to begin with, and it kind of bled a little bit. And then my A over here, so just kind of touch them up with a small little brush. I also found this paint marker, and I will link it up too. Sometimes if I did miss something, or if I just want to kind of touch up the black, especially the black, I prefer to use this marker because then I don't feel like I'm getting paint everywhere.
Now it's time to frame our sign, and this is my little tip for framing. I've got this thin little piece of plywood, maybe 1/2 inch thick, and then I line up the sides of my sign. I always do the sides first because those are the shorter boards and it's a lot easier. And I could probably use a clamp, but I don't have time for that, you guys. I just keep it going. And I just line this up, making sure that everything is flush and the sides of my frame are flush so that I can put the bottom pieces on. And then I just use my brad nailer and attach the frames to the sign. And leaving that little gap in the back actually will be easier for me to hang my sign in the end. So then that eliminates needing to have a hanger of some sort. So I could just put a couple of nails or even just one nail in the wall and hang it with that little gap that's in the back. So I'm going to put the rest of my frame on here, and then I'll show you guys that little gap in the back, And that is my finished sign for today. So I hope that you guys enjoyed these tips and tricks that I shared with you. Hopefully you learned something, and hopefully you'll come back to see the next sign in this series later on this week. If you're watching this later on, make sure you check the description down below, because I will have all of the videos linked up in this description so that you can check them all out and watch them all at once. I appreciate you guys watching. Thank you so much, and have a great day and happy crafting. For more behind the scenes on today's video, as well as bonus DIYs and just a little bit of fun, make sure you're following me over on Instagram. That's where the party's at. Thanks so much for watching.